Lorne Vance adjusted the collar of his worn, utilitarian jacket as the ship's docking clamp engaged with a low, metallic hiss. He hated outpost planets. They were always grimy, overrun by swindlers, and surrounded by landscapes so barren they made space itself seem lively by comparison. The only reason he'd agreed to take this cargo run was the promise of double payment for a late-night delivery, money he desperately needed after the last job went sour. He stepped out of the cargo bay and into a wide, dimly lit hangar. The air smelled faintly of burnt metal and some tangy alien oil he couldn't identify. A group of 3 men awaited him. 2 were burly, their muscles straining against standard-issue security uniforms. The third, slimmer and wearing an elaborate sash, stood out as the leader. Lorne Vance, the slim man said, his voice crisp and commanding. Lorne paused, his hand instinctively resting on the worn grip of his sidearm. "Who's asking?" The slim man took a step closer, the dim overhead lights catching on the metallic embroidery of his sash. "My name is Errol Var, adjutant to Queen Zariana. You will come with us." Lorne frowned. "What for?" "The Queen has summoned you." "That is all you need to know," Errol replied. Before Lorne could answer, one of the burly guards moved behind him, an unsubtle attempt at intimidation. Lorne felt the pressure in the room shift. "And if I refuse?" Errol's thin lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You are free to try." For a brief moment, Lorne considered pulling his weapon, but something in Errol's gaze warned him that wouldn't end well. Besides, he hadn't come all this way to start a fight over a delivery. "Fine," Lorne said, raising his hands. "Lead the way." Errol nodded, and the guards flanked Lorne as they walked out of the hangar. The corridors they entered were unlike anything Lorne had ever seen, smooth, flowing lines that pulsed faintly as if the walls themselves were alive. Alien symbols glowed faintly in the low light. Despite his growing unease, Lorne couldn't help but marvel at the architecture. The group ascended a long spiral ramp that wound around a central column filled with swirling, multicolored light. Lorne tried to get his bearings, but the corridors twisted and turned without any sense of direction. At last, they emerged into an enormous chamber. The ceiling soared above them, and massive, arched windows revealed a planet bathed in hues of red and gold. The throne room of Queen Zariana was vast yet intimate, a space designed not only to impress but also to unsettle. Lorne's eyes immediately went to the throne itself, perched atop a set of wide, shallow steps. It was more organic than he'd expected, curved, flowing lines of gleaming metal and something that looked like crystalline vines. And sitting upon it was Zariana herself. The queen was tall, her slender frame covered in intricate robes that shimmered in the room's soft light. Her skin had a subtle iridescence, like pearls dusted with gold. Long, jet-black hair fell over her shoulders, framing a face that was equal parts sharp and elegant. Most striking of all were her eyes, golden and piercing, like 2 suns that never blinked. Lorne stopped at the base of the steps. Errol gestured for him to kneel, but Lorne remained standing. The silence that followed felt like it could crush him. Zariana tilted her head, examining him closely. "You are the one they call Lorne Vance," she said, her voice calm yet carrying a weight that filled the room. "That's me," he replied. "And you do not kneel before your queen," she said, her tone more curious than offended. "Never been much of a kneeler," Lorne said. "Bad for the knees." A murmur ran through the chamber, but Zariana raised her hand, silencing it. Her golden eyes stayed locked on Lorne. "Interesting." She rose from the throne, descending the steps slowly. Her movements were deliberate, almost feline. The court watched in tense silence as she stopped just short of Lorne. "You intrigue me," Zariana said softly. "Few have the audacity to stand when I command them to kneel. Even fewer do so without trembling." Lorne kept his expression neutral. "Guess I don't scare easy." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Perhaps. Or perhaps you simply don't understand the gravity of the situation." "I understand enough," Lorne said, crossing his arms. "You brought me here for a reason." "I'm listening." Zariana studied him for a long moment. Then she turned away, motioning for the court to leave. "All of you, out." The courtiers and guards filed out quickly, leaving Lorne alone with the queen. Once they were gone, Zariana stepped closer, circling him slowly. "I have summoned you, Lorne Vance, because you are an anomaly," she said. "Most humans, most anyone, are predictable. You, however, are not. I find that valuable." "Valuable enough to drag me all the way here?" Lorne asked. "Yes," she said simply. "You've made a name for yourself among traitors, smugglers, even certain factions of your own kind. They say you're clever, resourceful, that you've outmaneuvered more powerful opponents time and again." Lorne raised an eyebrow. "You've done your homework." "I do not summon people lightly," Zariana said. She stopped in front of him, standing just close enough that he could see the subtle patterns in her iridescent skin. "But I must know, why do you refuse to kneel?" Lorne hesitated. He hadn't really thought about it. Guess it's just who I am, he said. I don't bow to anyone unless I think they deserve it. Zariana's golden eyes narrowed. And you do not think I deserve it? Not yet, he said, holding her gaze. A long silence stretched between them. Then, to his surprise, Zariana let out a soft, amused laugh. You are bold, Lorne Vance. Perhaps foolish, but bold nonetheless. Boldness pays the bills, he said. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of quiet intensity. We shall see. For now, you will remain here. Consider it a test of sorts. And if I don't want to stay? He asked. You have no choice, Zariana said, her tone firm. Guards will see you to your quarters. You will have everything you need, comforts, sustenance, even entertainment. But you will not leave this palace until I say so. Lorne clenched his jaw. He didn't like the idea of being a prisoner no matter how gilded the cage. But he also knew better than to push his luck now. Fine, he said. Lead the way. Zariana motioned to the guards who had re-entered the chamber. They escorted him out back through the twisting corridors. As he walked, Lorne couldn't help but wonder what the Queen really wanted and what she was willing to do to get it. Chapter 2, The Queen's Inquiry. Lorne adjusted his seating position for the third time, trying to find a comfortable angle on the overly elaborate chair. The dining hall was a blend of alien opulence and peculiar intimacy. The massive table that stretched down the center of the room could have easily hosted a banquet, yet tonight it only served two. At one end sat Queen Zariana, poised and unreadable, her golden eyes locked onto him. At the other end, Lorne found himself playing a strange sort of guest prisoner, unsure if this was an olive branch or a power move. So, this is how you treat all your prisoners? Lorne asked, motioning toward the intricately plated dishes in front of him. They were piled high with brightly colored, gelatinous forms and leafy greens that glowed faintly in the dim light. Do you feel like a prisoner, Lorne Vance? Zariana replied, tilting her head slightly. Her voice was calm, the kind of calm that made Lorne more nervous than outright hostility. He shrugged. You haven't exactly handed me a ticket home, if that's what you mean. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Your presence here is not a punishment. It is an opportunity. For what, exactly? Lorne asked, leaning forward slightly. You said you needed me for something, but you haven't exactly been forthcoming about the details. Zariana gestured to the plate in front of him. First, you should eat. You will need your strength. Lorne frowned at the glowing food. What is this stuff? A delicacy from my homeworld. Nutrient-rich and refined. He hesitated but eventually took a small bite. The texture was unlike anything he'd ever had, soft, almost silky, but it dissolved with a surprising burst of flavor that was neither sweet nor savory, yet oddly satisfying. Not bad, he admitted, setting his fork down. Still waiting on that explanation, though. Zariana considered him for a moment, then set her own utensil down with a deliberate motion. I've studied humans for some time now. Your kind is unique in ways my people have not fully understood. You make it sound like we're some kind of science experiment, Lorne said, crossing his arms. Not an experiment, Zariana corrected. A mystery. You possess traits that are inconsistent, to say the least. Your ingenuity, your contradictions, your capacity for destruction and creation in equal measure. It's all quite fascinating. Lorne raised an eyebrow. You brought me here to give a human history lesson? No, she said simply. I brought you here because I believe you can help me. Help you with what? That depends on your willingness, Zariana replied. Her gaze seemed to pierce through him, searching for something unspoken. There is a delicate balance in this region of space. My rule has kept the balance intact for many years, but challenges have arisen, challenges I believe your perspective may help me overcome. Lorne leaned back, skeptical. You expect me to believe that you need a down-on-his-luck trader to solve your problems? Sounds like you've got bigger issues than me. Do not underestimate yourself, Zariana said, her tone firm but not unkind. You have demonstrated resourcefulness that few possess. That is why you are here? Lorne thought about it for a moment, then shook his head. Still not buying it. If you're so impressed by me, why keep me under lock and key? To ensure your cooperation, she said, her voice calm. And to learn more about you. That's one way to make friends, Lorne muttered. Friendship is not my goal, Zariana said, standing gracefully and walking around the table. She moved with a fluidity that made it hard to tell where the Queen ended and the air around her began. Understanding is. Lorne watched as she stopped a few feet away, her golden eyes now level with his. For the first time, he noticed the faint, shifting patterns that danced across her skin like liquid light. He tried to focus on her words rather than her otherworldly presence. Understanding what? He asked. What drives you? What compels you to stand when others kneel? What fuels the decisions you make, Zariana said, her voice quieter now, almost contemplative. Lorne stared at her. What makes you think I'll tell you any of that? You already have, Zariana replied, her lips curving into a faint smile. Not with words, but with your actions. And actions, as you know, speak far louder. Lorne found himself at a loss for a reply. He hated feeling like he was being read like a book, especially by someone as enigmatic as this queen. Why not just ask me, he said after a moment. Why all the mystery? Zariana's smile faded slightly and her expression grew serious. Because, Lorne Vance, some truths are not given freely. They must be uncovered. And what happens if you don't like what you uncover? Then I will decide what must be done, she said simply. But I believe that will not be necessary. Before Lorne could press her further, Errol stepped into the dining hall, bowing slightly. Your Majesty, the preparations are complete. Good, Zariana said, her attention briefly shifting to Errol. Escort our guest to the observation chamber. Lorne stood, his curiosity outweighing his frustration. Observation chamber? Zariana's eyes returned to him. You asked for details. This will provide them. Follow Errol and you will begin to understand why I have summoned you. Fine, Lorne said, glancing at Errol. Lead the way. Errol nodded and motioned for Lorne to follow. As they left the dining hall, Lorne couldn't help but glance back at Zariana. She remained standing at the table, her gaze thoughtful as if she were piecing together a puzzle only she could see. The corridors wound and twisted again, the same disorienting architecture as before. Lorne tried to keep track of the turns, but it was futile. At last, they arrived at a large, circular room with a domed ceiling that shimmered like the night sky. The walls were lined with intricate consoles and holographic displays, each one showing scenes from what appeared to be multiple star systems. What is this place? Lorne asked. This is where the Queen watches the worlds under her rule, Errol replied, and where she evaluates threats to their stability. Lorne stepped closer to one of the displays. It showed a bustling alien city, its streets alive with strange, insectoid beings moving through a maze of transparent walkways. Another display showed a mining outpost on a barren moon, its surface scarred by deep craters and enormous machinery. This is what she's worried about? Lorne asked. Among other things, Errol said. Her Majesty believes your insight may prove invaluable. Lorne frowned. And what exactly am I supposed to do? Errol gestured to the largest display in the center of the room. It showed a distant star system with a faintly glowing planet surrounded by a fleet of sleek, alien vessels. That, Errol said, his voice lowering, is what you are here to help her prevent. Lorne stared at the display, the faint hum of the machinery filling the silence. Whatever Zariana had planned, it was clear that it was just the beginning. Chapter 3, The Proposal. Lorne walked into the war room at Zariana's summons, his boots clicking against the pristine metallic floor. The large chamber was awash with light from multiple hollow displays, each one showing a different sector of space, clusters of ships, and trade routes overlaid with bright lines. Zariana stood at the central console, her hands resting lightly on its surface. The ever-present Errol stood by her side, his expression neutral but attentive. I hope you've got some answers, Lorne said, crossing his arms as he approached. Because I'm getting real tired of the guessing game. Zariana didn't look up immediately. Instead, she tapped a sequence of glowing symbols on the console and a particular star system expanded to fill the central display. Only then did she turn her attention to Lorne. You may find that the answers I offer require you to ask better questions, she said, her golden eyes locking onto his. Sure, Lorne replied. I'll start with this one. Why am I here? Zariana's lips quirked into a faint smile. Direct as always. Very well. You're here because your species has a certain knack for problem-solving under pressure. Flattery's nice and all, but that doesn't tell me anything, Lorne said. If you want my help, you're going to have to be a lot more specific. Zariana stepped aside, motioning to the expanded star system. This sector, the Coriath Reach, has been a crossroads of trade for centuries. My fleet patrols these routes, ensuring that no one faction gains too much control. It is not war that threatens this balance, but rather, she trailed off, her expression hardening. Rather what? Lorne prompted. Rather greed, Errol said, stepping forward. There are those who see an opportunity to exploit the Reach. Unchecked, they could destabilize the entire network. Exploitation how? Lorne asked, squinting at the display. Smuggling, piracy, corrupt officials? All of it, Zariana replied. It begins small, unauthorized tariffs, bribes to overlook violations, increased attacks on independent traders. Left unchecked, these actions spread, creating a chain reaction of distrust and economic collapse. And you want me to fix it? Lorne said, skeptical. I'm one guy. Even if I wanted to help, I'm not exactly in charge of a fleet or a treasury. You misunderstand, Zariana said. I don't need a fleet commander. I need someone who understands the mindset of those who operate in the shadows, someone who can anticipate their moves. Lorne's eyebrows rose. You want me to think like a criminal? Not think, Zariana corrected. Predict. And what's in it for me? Lorne asked. A place among my advisors, Zariana said. Resources, protection, influence. Your efforts will not go unrewarded. Lorne considered her words. Sounds like a nice offer, but I'm not sure I trust you. Trust must be earned, Zariana said. I am offering you the chance to earn it for both of us. Lorne didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to the console, examining the star system in greater detail. He recognized a few of the trade routes and outposts. He'd run goods through similar sectors before, and while it wasn't exactly a walk in the park, he knew enough about the patterns and pressure points. So, what's the plan? Lorne asked at last. You will accompany Errol to one of the more contentious stations in the Coriath Reach, Zariana said. There, you'll assess the situation firsthand. Identify the key players, uncover the sources of corruption, and report back. Sounds easy enough, Lorne said with a smirk. Except for the part where everyone there will probably hate me. Not everyone, Errol said. We'll ensure you have support, discreetly, of course. It is in my queen's interest that you succeed. And what about you? Lorne asked, turning to Zariana. What's your interest in all this? Zariana's expression softened, but only slightly. My interest is stability. A strong, thriving Coriath Reach benefits my people and ensures peace in this sector. What benefits you is another matter entirely. Fair enough, Lorne said. But don't expect miracles. Only results, Zariana replied. Lorne nodded, then turned to Errol. So, when do we leave? Immediately, Errol said. A shuttle is prepped and ready. Follow me. As Errol led Lorne out of the war room, Zariana watched them go. Her gaze lingered on Lorne's retreating figure, her thoughts unreadable. She remained standing there for a long moment, the light from the holographic displays casting shifting patterns across her features. When the doors closed behind them, she turned back to the console, her fingers resuming their intricate sequence of commands. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she knew this gamble was just beginning. Chapter 4, The Dance of Equals. Lorne shuffled awkwardly in the ceremonial robes provided to him. The silken material felt restrictive, and the elaborate patterns stitched into the fabric were clearly meant to impress rather than offer comfort. He adjusted the collar for what felt like the 100th time, tugging at the high neckline as he stood at the edge of the grand hall. The room was alive with activity. Alien dignitaries in their flowing attire moved about, their voices blending into a hum of conversation. The air carried an unfamiliar fragrance, a mix of floral sweetness and something metallic. Try not to look so uncomfortable, Errol muttered, stepping beside him. The adjutant, clad in his own ceremonial attire, looked much more at ease. You're supposed to be representing humanity tonight, after all. Thanks for the pep talk, Lorne said dryly. Next time I'll make sure to pack my intergalactic formal wear. Errol smirked faintly, then straightened as. Made her seem like a living constellation. Her golden eyes scanned the room, calm and commanding. Lorne had to admit she knew how to make an entrance. The queen moved gracefully to the center of the hall, her presence alone enough to part the crowd. As she reached her designated position, a group of musicians seated on a raised platform began to play. The music was unlike anything Lorne had ever heard, a complex arrangement of harmonies that seemed to ebb and flow like a tide. It filled the room with a sense of anticipation. Errol leaned closer to Lorne. This is a very old tradition, he explained quietly. The dance signifies unity and cooperation among allies. And what's my part in all this? Lorne asked. Errol didn't answer right away. Instead, he inclined his head towards Zariana. The queen extended a hand and the crowd's attention shifted to Lorne. You're joking, Lorne said under his breath. Errol smirked again. Afraid not. Go on. Lorne muttered a curse and stepped forward, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. He approached Zariana, who stood calmly, her hands still extended. Don't keep me waiting, Lorne Vance, she said, her tone light but firm. He hesitated for a moment, then placed his hand in hers. Her grip was warm, steady. She guided him to the center of the hall, and the music shifted subtly, softer, more measured. I should warn you, I'm not much of a dancer, Lorne said, trying to sound casual. Then you will learn, Zariana replied with a faint smile. Do not worry, I will lead. She began moving, and Lorne did his best to follow. The steps were more intricate than he expected, but Zariana's movements were smooth and deliberate, making it easier for him to mimic. At first, he stumbled, earning a few muted chuckles from the onlookers. Zariana remained patient, her expression unreadable. She repeated the sequence until he began to find his footing. "You're doing well," she said quietly, her voice just audible over the music. "Better than I thought I would," Lorne admitted. "Not exactly my usual line of work." "This is more than a mere dance," Zariana said, guiding him through a turn. "It is a demonstration. A message to everyone in this room that we can move together, different as we may be. Right?" "No pressure," Lorne said, trying not to trip over his own feet. As they continued, he began to notice the rhythm of her movements. It wasn't just the music guiding her, it was something more instinctive. She moved with purpose, every step a statement of balance and poise. Lorne found himself paying closer attention not only to her steps but to the way her golden eyes softened slightly whenever he got it right. "Not bad for someone who claims not to dance," Zariana said after a particularly smooth sequence. "Must be your expert teaching," Lorne replied. Her lips curved into a small smile. "Flattery will not save you if you misstep." "Noted," he said, focusing on his footing. As the dance progressed, Lorne began to feel a shift in the atmosphere. The crowd, once quietly skeptical, now watched with interest. The musicians added more layers to the melody, and the entire hall seemed to hum with an energy that was almost palpable. "Why do you go to so much trouble for this?" Lorne asked as they moved through another series of steps. "The whole show, the ceremony. What's the endgame?" Zariana's expression grew more serious. "Because appearances matter. My people need to see strength tempered by grace. They must believe that cooperation is not only possible but desirable." "And me?" he asked. "What do I represent?" "You are the proof that we can work together," she said simply. "An outsider who is willing to learn, to adapt. That is more powerful than any speech I could give." Lorne absorbed her words as they continued to move. The steps began to feel less foreign, and he found himself more attuned to her rhythm. For the first time, he felt like an active participant rather than someone just trying not to mess up. When the music finally came to a close, the hall erupted into applause. Zariana released his hand and stepped back, giving him a small nod of approval. "You did well, Lorne Vance," she said. "Thanks," he said, running a hand through his hair. "I think." Errol approached, his expression unreadable. "That was surprisingly effective." "Thanks for the vote of confidence," Lorne said dryly. Zariana looked at him thoughtfully. "This was only the beginning. You have more to learn and more to do. But tonight, you have shown that you can rise to the occasion." Lorne met her gaze and nodded. "Guess we'll see how long that lasts." With that, the crowd began to disperse, and Lorne finally allowed himself to relax. He still wasn't entirely sure what he had gotten himself into, but for now, at least, he had managed to keep up with the Queen. That, he figured, was no small feat. Chapter 5. The Unspoken Bond. Lorne stretched out on the cushioned bench in the private chamber Zariana had provided. The room was quiet, illuminated by the soft glow of crystalline fixtures embedded in the walls. After the night's elaborate ceremony, it was a relief to be away from prying eyes. He leaned back, letting his gaze wander over the alien architecture. The walls seemed alive, their patterns shifting like the surface of a still pond disturbed by a gentle breeze. It was unlike anything he'd ever seen before, and yet, it was already starting to feel strangely familiar. A soft chime broke his reverie. Moments later, the door slid open with a whisper, and Zariana entered. She was no longer wearing the elaborate ceremonial attire from earlier. Instead, she wore a simpler, flowing gown that shimmered faintly in the room's dim light. Her presence filled the space instantly. Though she moved quietly, her steps almost soundless. "Am I interrupting your solitude?" Zariana asked, her tone polite but not distant. Lorne sat up and shook his head. "Not at all. I was just thinking." "About the dance?" she inquired, stepping further into the room. "Among other things," Lorne replied, motioning toward one of the empty chairs. "Feel free to sit. I'm guessing you don't just drop by for a chat every day." Zariana tilted her head slightly, considering his invitation. Then, without a word, she seated herself across from him. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried an unspoken weight. "You performed well tonight," she said at last. Lorne let out a short laugh. "I don't think anyone would call me graceful, but thanks." "You adapted quickly," Zariana continued. "More quickly than most." He shrugged. "Not my first time being thrown into the deep end." She studied him for a moment, her golden eyes calm but searching. You've faced many challenges in your life, haven't you? Who hasn't? Lorne said, deflecting slightly. I've met many who crumble under pressure, Zariana said. But you seem to thrive in it. Let's just say I've had practice, Lorne replied. He hesitated before adding, and what about you? You make all of this look easy, but I can't imagine it's simple, keeping all these factions in line, holding everything together. Zariana's expression softened, if only slightly. It is not easy, but it is necessary. That's not really an answer, Lorne pointed out. She arched a delicate eyebrow. It is the answer I am willing to give. Fair enough, Lorne said, leaning back again. Another silence settled between them. This one, however, was different. It wasn't the silence of strangers nor the silence of people with nothing to say. It felt more like the calm after a storm, a moment of quiet understanding that didn't need to be filled with words. I've been wondering, Lorne said finally, why you keep involving me in all of this. I mean, I get that you think I can help, but why me specifically? There must be plenty of others more qualified, more experienced. Zariana's gaze didn't waver. Because you are not like them. You approach problems in ways I have not seen before. You see possibilities where others see limitations. Lorne frowned. You make me sound a lot more impressive than I really am. Perhaps you underestimate yourself, she said simply. He wasn't sure how to respond to that. Instead, he changed the subject. So, what's next? Another dance? A grand speech? Some other ceremony I'm not ready for? Zariana's lips curved into a faint smile. No more ceremonies. For now at least. Well, that's a relief, Lorne said. Not that I didn't enjoy the last one, but I think I've hit my quota for formal events this month. I'll keep that in mind, Zariana said, and for a moment it almost sounded like a joke. The conversation drifted into lighter territory, small stories about his past as a trader, her experiences as a ruler. Lorne was surprised at how easily the conversation flowed. Zariana was reserved, yes, but she was also perceptive and quick-witted. The more they talked, the more he began to see her as something other than an untouchable monarch. She was still every bit the queen, but she was also someone who carried a heavy burden, someone who had learned to wear her authority like armor. Eventually, the topic turned to Earth. You must miss your home, Zariana said, her tone more subdued now. Lorne paused before answering. Sometimes. But it's not the same as it used to be. A lot's changed, and not all of it for the better. Zariana nodded slowly. Change is often difficult. It forces us to adapt, to reconsider what we value. That's one way of putting it, Lorne said. I guess I just got used to moving on. After a while, you stop getting attached. Is that what you believe? She asked. He looked at her, caught off guard by the question. I'm not sure. Maybe. Zariana leaned forward slightly, her golden eyes fixed on him. Perhaps you've only convinced yourself of that because it is easier than admitting the opposite. Lorne didn't respond right away. Her words struck a little too close to the truth, and he didn't like that. But there was no malice in her tone, just an observation made quietly and without judgment. I guess I never thought about it that way, he admitted eventually. They sat in silence for a while after that, neither of them feeling the need to break it. The room's soft glow seemed warmer now, more comforting. When Zariana finally stood, Lorne thought she would simply leave, but she paused by his chair. Good night, Lorne, she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. Good night, he replied. She walked out, the door sliding shut behind her. Lorne remained seated, staring at the closed door. It wasn't until several minutes later that he realized he was still smiling. Chapter 6, The Queen and the Wanderer. The pale morning light filtered through the high, crystalline windows of the palace's strategy chamber. Lorne stood at the main console, his arms crossed as he examined the sprawling holomap projected above it. The map was a living thing, with trade routes glowing in steady pulses, indicators for diplomatic missions blinking, and warning symbols marking unstable sectors. The Coriath Reach looked calmer now, still complex and fragile, but no longer on the verge of chaos. Queen Zariana entered quietly, her footsteps barely audible on the polished floor. She stopped a few paces behind him and observed the holomap for a moment before speaking. You've made good progress. Lorne turned, meeting her golden gaze. Couldn't have done it without Errol and the rest of your team. And, well, you. She approached the console, standing beside him. The Reach is more stable now than it has been in years. The alliances we forged, the reforms you suggested, each step brings us closer to lasting peace. Lorne nodded. It's not perfect, but it's a start. I guess that's the most you can hope for in a place like this. Zariana glanced at him, her expression softer than he was used to seeing. You've done more than most would have in your position. I'm just trying to help, Lorne said. And you have, she replied. More than you realize. They fell into a comfortable silence, the hum of the holomap filling the room. Zariana tapped a command, and the projection shifted, zooming in on a cluster of trade routes where the activity seemed most stable. This area is flourishing again, she said. It was nearly lost before you arrived. Lorne studied the map, then turned back to her. So what now? You've got a stronger network, better oversight, and a bunch of people who finally trust each other enough to work together. Where do you go from here? We keep building, Zariana said. We ensure that these alliances endure, and we prepare for the challenges that will inevitably come. Sounds like you've got it all figured out, Lorne said. Not all, Zariana admitted, but enough to begin the next phase. Lorne chuckled. Always a next phase, isn't there? Always, she said, smiling faintly. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Lorne cleared his throat. You know, when I first got here, I didn't think much of you. Thought you were just another ruler trying to throw her weight around. And now? Zariana asked, her tone curious. Now I see what you're trying to do, he said. You're not just holding on to power for the sake of it. You actually care about these people, about making things better. She inclined her head slightly. It is not enough to rule. One must also serve. Well, you've got my respect, Lorne said. For what that's worth. More than you think, she replied, her golden eyes meeting his. There was a quiet understanding in that moment, something unspoken but deeply felt. Lorne had always been a wanderer, moving from one job to the next, never staying long enough to feel attached. But now, here in this alien palace with this alien queen, he felt something shift. He didn't quite know what it was, only that it was important. So, he said, trying to lighten the mood, does this mean I get a medal or something? Zariana's faint smile returned. Perhaps I'll consider it. Or at least a vacation, Lorne joked. Someplace with less bureaucracy. Perhaps I'll consider that as well, Zariana said, a hint of amusement in her voice. They stood side by side, looking at the map. The reach was stable for now. The work was far from over, but for the first time it felt like they had a real chance. I think I'll stick around, Lorne said after a long pause. Zariana turned to him, her expression neutral but her eyes warm. You would be welcome here. Yeah, well, someone's got to keep an eye on this place, he said. Make sure you don't start slacking off. I will do my best to maintain my standards, Zariana replied, her tone dry but with a glint of humor. Good, Lorne said, a small smile playing at his lips. And with that, the Queen and the Wanderer returned to the task at hand, side by side. Their work was not done, but they faced it together, ready for whatever came next.